Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and this next video we're going to do is we're going to build authentication. Again, it's been a while since I've done Ruby on Rails. I generally teach a course in it every few months, but you know, if you've been coding for a while, you'll notice you forget things after a while, so you always have to kind of refresh yourself, which is another reason I like making these videos. It gives me an opportunity to refresh myself before I teach a course. So what I want to do is create authentication. Okay, I want there to be users that can log in, and I do have a tutorial on this on my blog site, toots.alexmercedcoder.com. So let's scroll down there, and find that authentication tutorial, and let's walk through it together. Remember, it's pretty straightforward. Ruby on Rails, here we go. Okay, we already set up the project, that's all done. Okay, and configuring your dependencies. Yes, we need to add some dependencies. Okay, so we're gonna need bcrypt because bcrypt encrypts passwords. So if you've seen my Express tutorials, you're familiar with bcrypt. We need cores because it's gonna allow us to configure cores, and we're gonna need JWT. So most of these should already be here. So if I look through the gem file, see there's bcrypt, so I can just uncomment that out. And I should be able to find one other one. I think I saw it earlier. Here we go, rack cores. And I think JWT I have to add. Okay, so it's just gem JWT. And let me just double check that that's what it is. Yep. And just so you know, when you're reading this file, basically what you can do is you can specify specific versions to install. So that's what you see with these commands here. And then also you can actually say certain things are used in certain environments. So say here, this is saying only install this library if we're in development mode, or on certain platforms. So it's you can do some cool stuff in your gem file. Most of the time you don't need to, but just so you're aware that you can do that. Cool. So that's done. Now I generally have these libraries installed, but just in case you run another bundle install to install anything you were missing, I made a typo somewhere. Probably right at the JWT. So let me take a look at this. Oh, I always do the same exact error. Get JWT. It's gem JWT. I've written so many get routes in my life that you know, it happens. Okay, so there we go. It's gonna run through the thing. So it's installing bcrypt again, and there it goes. It's done. Cool. Okay, so that makes sure that we have those particular dependencies. Good. Okay, so again, that's done. Next thing we want to do is that now there should be a course configuration within our files. That's going to be inside the config. Again, all your config files are all in config. That's one of the things about Rails. Again, it's a lot less about code and more than configuration. The idea is that if everyone just sets certain configurations, then you have to code less because you can have boilerplate that kind of handles most of the work. So in your config file, I'm gonna open this back up, and or I can just take a look. It's config initializers cores. Okay, and then here, what I want is cores. So here's where we can set our core settings. Okay, it's commented out right now because it's not assuming that you are going to be using cores. But then you just comment out this part. Okay, so that's the part that gets uncommented out. And the only thing you want to do is really kind of take this part where it says example.com and replace it with an asterisk. What the asterisk means is it means anybody can make a request. It's just you're not specifying a specific, you're not blocking any URLs, which is fine for now. We can always go back and change that once we actually have a front-end Netlify URL that we know we want to allow and block everything else. So right now, it's allowing any request to be made on any resources with any headers with any methods. Okay, so anyone can make a request to our API, but you can always, you know, do more stuff with this later. Okay, cool. So now that we have that set up, we need to set up our auth routes. So let's go to our routes file. So I'm going to head over to config, and that's where we're going to find our routes. I always find that kind of weird that an app will find our controllers, our models, but the routes are over here in config. I'm used to it now, but yeah. Okay, so this is basically the file where we can do all our routing. Right now it's empty because we just started this project. And I just need to add these particular routes. I'm just going to copy them from the tutorial and walk you through them. Okay, so resource. Okay, so when you're creating routes, as you create models, you might want like all the CRUD routes, right? So Ruby has a keyword that says, okay, for this model that you have in your project, provided all the basic CRUD routes. So it just automatically defines all those routes. And I'll show you how we can prove that in a second. So it's going to assume that we're going to create a user's model. And for that user's model, resource is providing us all the CRUD routes. So show, index, create, update, destroy. But we can specify that we only want create from that bundle. So that's all this is saying, hey, create the resource routes for users, but really only create, which is excessive. You think you would just make a create route. Okay. And then here we're specifying a post request to an endpoint called login. And when you hit that endpoint, it's going to take you to users login. So basically the way it works is that this is the model. So there's going to be a model called users. And then the function that handles this request is a function called login. Okay? So the users model login function. That's kind of how the route reads. This is a get request to auto login. And this auto login route is really just going to be there for us to test the login. So that's what that is. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. Now, if I want to know what routes the application has, I just type in Rails, I think it's routes, Rails routes. And what this is going to do is see it lists all the routes. So if I go back over here, I can see users post. Okay, so that's the create. Remember we said we only wanted the create. And then there's users login, there's auto login, and then there's a bunch of these default ones that kind of come out of the box with Rails. So that's all there. Okay, so that's set up. Creating the user model. Okay, so we're going to use this command called model to create the model. So whenever you do Rails G, that means Rails generate. And allows you to generate one of many things. You can generate a controller, generate a model, generate a you can generate everything using the scaffold or resource command. But we don't necessarily need everything. So we're going to just do it step by step. So we're going to create a model. So that's going to be the name of the model. Or we're going to create a model called user. And we can define the fields in that right away, which is going to be username string, password digest. Now the reason why we have to do this password underscore digest instead of just password is that bcrypt expects there to be a field called password digest that it uses to create the password, which is going to be like a hashed encrypted string. So basically we just have to follow the convention there. And then age, it's going to be a number. Okay? Because why not? We actually don't even need the age if we don't want, but why not? Okay. So I go into the terminal, I type in Rails G model, so I'm generating a model, and then model's called user. Always make it singular in uppercase. It'll kind of adjust the casing and the pluralization where it's needed. So basically user. Okay. User, and again it's going to have a username field that's a string. It's going to have a password digest string. Let me just confirm this as I go along. Password string, yep. Password digest string, age integer. And the age integer thing is really just there to show you that you can specify other types. You know, you can specify booleans, integers. If you have like a reference to another field, you can just type in that model and say reference. It's a lot you can do there, all in one line of code, okay, or one line in your terminal. So I type that in, and then this tells you what files were just generated. So it created these two files. It created a models file and a migration file. The migration file is going to let us create the table in the database. Okay, and then it created like a test file. These we're not going to really use. Okay, Now the next, I'm assuming is going to be to migrate. Okay. Okay, actually I don't think it mentions it, so let's just do it ourselves. Okay. So essentially what you want to do is you run a migration, and the migration does, it creates the table in your database with the right information. Okay. But actually before we do that, we'll keep going with the controller in case I did put that later on. So we're going to head into user RB. We're going to go to the model. Okay, and we're just going to add this macro. Now, a macro, okay, because when you first learn Rails, these macros seem like magic. Like there's like just some keywords that you just put there, magical things happen. What's really going on is that under the hood, in the parent class for user, so the user is inheriting from this application record class. In that record class has all these functions inside of it. And the idea is that when you run this function, it's essentially running this function on itself and adding methods or adding properties, so you don't have to do it. So basically this is a function, because again, in Ruby, you don't have to invoke functions with parentheses. So a lot of these times when you see these keywords, it's kind of confusing because it just looks like you just plopped a random variable name there. But really, it knows it's a function, then runs the function. Because everything is an object, everything kind of acts like a function in Ruby. It's definitely something that always takes me a second to get used to whenever I'm back in Ruby mode. So that's where these things come from. Okay, now technically this macro came from the bcrypt library, but the idea is that all these macros are either inherited through application record or through the parent class or provided by some library, and they basically are functions that are wrapping the class. Okay, so we're going to head over to app models, and there's user ID, and we're going to add has underscore secure password. And this just basically allows there to be the methods to secure a password. Just allows it to just kind of make it happen. Cool. Now we need to create a controller. Again, the controller is where we define the routes. Okay. So we're going to use Rails G again. Rails to generate. So we're going to Rails. Oops. Rails G controller. I'm pretty sure it should be just user, right? Yep, Rails G controller users. Okay. Okay, and let me go back to the routes just to make sure that makes sense. Yep, because see, the routes point to a controller called user. So technically, it's not the model that this is pointing to. So I misquoted myself earlier. It's pointing to a controller, so it's going to look for a controller by that name, users. So if we go to controllers now, see there's users controller. Okay. And then it's going to use that to find all the relevant routes. So now the controller is created. Now, before we do that, we have configured the database already, so that's been done. Okay. Now, I'll go back and do this later. This is just going to be so that way when we get to Heroku, it will pass in the database URL later on, but we can always come back to that. Okay, so take a variable, blah, blah, blah. Okay, we already created the database, so we ran that command earlier. And so we just need to migrate. Just need to run that migration file. And what a migration file does, it just defines like what tables need to be added or subtracted to the database. Because the idea is this: instead of you going in there and creating all these tables manually in Postgres, you create migration files that kind of say the step-by-step of how you created the current version of your database. And the beauty of this is that now when I go to another empty database, so let's say we are going to upload this to Heroku, and then we're going to have our own Heroku Postgres database. It's going to be sort of blank and empty. What's going to happen is that will what's the word I'm thinking of? You just run the migrations and it sets everything up again. Okay, in the exact order that you did it before. It takes a lot of the headaches out of, did configure everything exactly the same way I did last time with the same exact SQL commands. Okay, so Rails DB migrate. Okay, Rails DB migrate, nice. Okay, so that created the users table in the database. Now we're going to seed some data. So you can initially add data. And the way you do that is we head over to, we have a seed file somewhere. Let me just close everything up. It should be in the database folder. Yep, right here. And we see the seeds.rb. So when we run the seed command, this file will run and seed our database. Okay, and you can use any of your models right out of the gate. So like that case, well, I don't want to do that. So we have a user model, okay, and I want to create a new user. And let me just take a look at how we do the syntax here. User.create. Okay, we have to make a new user variable. So user equals user.create. And then here we just pass the key values. I always find that odd that you can just literally pass a hash without like curly brackets, but it's a thing you can do. Okay. Okay. Username, for me it'll be, we'll just do a test. Password, test, and age 35. Okay, and let me just make sure that all looks good. Yep. Cool. And then I just run Rails dbseed, and I can do all sorts. I can do anything I want in here. It's just going to run this file when I do dbseed. So Rails dbseed. There it goes. It ran the file. Okay. Right now, you just have to kind of believe me that it's there. But if you really want to know, we can always go to the console. Now, I could just do PSQL and go back to the Postgres console like I did before. But Rails has its own command for doing so. So I can go to Rails DB console, and it takes me to the console, logged in as the user, into the database for the database I have set configured. Okay. So here I am. See, so I'm in the database as user test 5. So now I can list all the tables. And see, there's the users table. It exists. And let's just select all. Select all from users. Okay, and there it is. There's the test user. And again, see, bcrypt hashes the password. So bcrypt is working. It hashed the password. And see, age 35. So it worked. We've seeded the database. Okay, and let me just get the out of here. I think it's escape. No. Q. There we go. And then the quit Postgres is just \q. Clear the terminal. Okay. Cool. So we've seeded the database. That's all good. Now we're going to create all of the application controller. This part, basically, you just kind of want to. I'll just copy everything in the middle and I'll explain what this is doing. Now, the application controller is a very particular controller. It's like your global controller. Okay, so if I go to app controllers, here's the application controller. So I'm going to add these methods here and we'll come back and discuss them. But basically, this inherits from this action controller, which is a very base controller that's built into Rails. This application controller becomes what all your other controllers inherit from. So the idea is that any methods you add to the application controller are added to all your controllers. So what we're doing by putting a lot of this authentication logic in the application controllers, we're providing that logic to all our other controllers. Okay. So here's another example of a macro. What this macro just basically does is just says, run this function before hitting any of the routes in this controller. That's all it is. And there's no real routes in this controller. So it's more one we're going to be using in other controllers. But let's kind of follow it. So it says before action is authorized. So let's go find the authorized function. So it runs this function. what this function says is that you're going to render the JSON please log in if the status is unauthorized. Okay, unless logged in. So that means it will assume that your status is unauthorized unless this logged in function is true, returns true. So then we need to go to the logged in function right here. And this function just basically returns true or false based on whether logged in user returns true or false. Kind of a weird way of doing things, but it's the way it is. Okay, so what logged in user does, okay, if decoded token returns a token, so the idea is that it actually has a value, it's not null, because null would be false, a token would value it as true, then, so you have a logged in user, then we're going to take the user ID and decode the token, okay, and that should give us the user ID, and then we're going to add a property, so this is a instance property, so it's actually adding a property to the controller called user, which looks for the user in the database and then assigns the user to that property. And the cool thing about that is that technically what this does is that it makes the user and the user data available to all our other routes, because any route that is authenticated is going to go through this process, which means in the process, if the user is authenticated, it's adding the user data to the controller, and we'll have access to this user property in our routes. Very nice. Okay, but again, that's if decoded token. And what does decoded token do? It's checking if there's an auth header, and that's all this does. It just says, checks to see if there's an auth header. Okay, and returns the header. So if there's an auth header, then it's going to parse it for the token. Then it's going to decode it using JWT. So basically passes in the secret, so we can change this secret thing if we want it to be something else. We're not going to worry about that right now. And yeah, that's it. It'll decode the token, and then if that token is decoded, then the decoded token gets parsed. We add the user, which then means it's authenticated, and then these things get marked as true, and then this all works. Okay, so that's essentially what that is doing. This is purely like boilerplate in the sense that you never really have to tweak this. Okay, the only things you'd ever have to change is like the secret. Okay, you generally want to have like something that's kind of unique to your project, and honestly, you probably want that as an environmental variable. Okay, but we're not going to worry about that at the moment. Okay, so that's that. Now what we want to do is edit the user controller. So I'm going to copy all the stuff that belongs in the user controller from the tutorial. Head over to the user controller and see if I see before action it says authorize. So it's running that authorize function, and the reason why it has access to the authorize function because again it inherits the application controller, and the application controller is where we defined the authorize function. So what it's going to do is going to run this function before the route. So all that logic we just talked about always happens before the route happens. That's why the user will be available to the routes. Okay? But it's saying only use authorized for the auto login route. So it's only using it for this route. Okay, and if you're wondering what the syntax is, always with the colons, these are referred to as symbols. Symbols are essentially you use them as strings. This is always really confusing when you first start learning Ruby, because it's like, why do I need something else if I can just use strings? It really has to do with under the hood memory management. So what happens is that when you use a symbol, it creates one instance of the symbol under the hood. So there's one spot in your memory that has this phrase auto login, and then there's like a symbol table that's pointing, so whenever you use that again, it's just pointing to that one spot in your memory. If I were to do quotations like here, this every time you use a quotations mark, so if I use invalid username and password as a string multiple times, each time it's actually creating a separate instance of that string. So it's a separate usage of memory. So for phrases you're going to be using a lot, and they're just really labels at the end of the day. You're not really using them as strings. You're just really using them as a label. You're going to improve the performance of your application by using them as symbols. It does take a while to get used to if you're new to Ruby. Okay, it definitely took me a while to kind of get used to that whole symbol idea. But certainly one that if you understand, suddenly also makes a lot of things make sense in JavaScript and in other languages. Okay. Cool. Okay. So in this case, what we have here, we have our registration route. Okay, so it just basically says this is our create route, which just creates a user, just takes the data that's passed in and creates a user. Login takes the user that's passed in and checks to see if it's correct. I mean, this is standard authentication stuff. Again, this is all boilerplate, so you could literally do it the same way every time. And then auto login, again, is just going to return the user. That's literally all it does. It's just to see, like, you can only hit this route if authentication is working. Okay. So what I'm going to do now, and then this is just something grabbing the params from the route, if the route has params. Okay, so that's all good. And I think for the most part we have the authentication all set now. Yep, time to test it. So let's test it real quick and then we'll wrap this one up. Rails serve. Or I think I'm going to do Rails server. There we go. I'm going to open up Postman. Okay, so it's localhost 3000. We're making a post request because we're going to log in, but let's figure out what that route is again. So let me go back to my routes. If I look at routes, it should be /login. Okay, that I need to post to. So if I go to /login, and then I'm going to send over some JSON data. So JSON data, and I just need to send over my username and password. Username was test, and the password was test. Okay. I hit send. There we go. Now be careful, because see, this is your password. This is your token. Okay, we need a token for authentication. So I'm going to copy this token. Okay, and now I'm going to try to hit that auto login route. But again, if I try to hit that auto login route, which should be a GET request, right now, see, it says please log in because I don't have a token. So now I have to go into my headers. I'm going to add the authorization token. And the way the token's always set up is you write the word bearer, space, and then you paste the token. And then you hit send. And now, see, I get my user back. Because all those details are encoded in the JWT token. Okay, cool. So it works. We got authentication all set up. In the next video, we'll set up the actual API of notes and associate it with a user. And I'll see you guys there. Ciao.